The Cold War in Latin America was not just a period of ideological tension between global superpowers, it was a time of fear, repression, and chaos that reached into every corner of society. In many countries across the region, the conflict wasn't fought on distant battlefields, but in city streets, rural villages, and within the walls of people's homes. Insurgencies and counterinsurgencies erupted as social and political inequalities deepened. Governments, in their desperate attempts to maintain control, resorted to authoritarian measures, silencing opposition through intimidation, imprisonment, and violence. In this landscape of fear, Argentina became one of the most tragic examples of how the global Cold War transformed into a brutal internal struggle. I'm your host, David, and today, we journey into one of the darkest chapters in Argentina's history. It's Dirty War. The wounds left by that era remain open, and the echoes of its terror still haunt generations of Argentines to this very day. This is the Cold War. Between 1976 and 1983, Argentina was gripped by a nightmare that didn't come from a foreign enemy, but from its own leaders. The generals who seized control of the government promised to restore order, stability, and traditional values. They claimed to be saving the nation from the growing threat of communism. What followed instead was a horrifying campaign of state-sponsored terror that saw thousands of citizens kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, all under the justification of national security. The war they fought was not on open battlefields but in secret detention centers, dark interrogation rooms, and through the silent fear that spread across neighborhoods. It was a war with no official records, no visible fronts, and no clear end to war against the people themselves. Argentina's collapse into dictatorship didn't happen overnight. The country had been experiencing deep political and social instability for years. The late 1960s and early 1970s were marked by a rise in political violence, economic decline, and growing discontent among workers and students. When the aging leader, Juan Perón, returned to power in 1973, hopes for national unity quickly crumbled. His death the following year left his widow, Isabel Perón, as president. She was unprepared for the chaos that followed. Left-wing guerrilla movements like the Montoneros and the People's Revolutionary Army launched attacks, kidnappings, and bombings in the name of revolution. At the same time, right-wing death squads, often supported by elements within the government, targeted suspected radicals, journalists, and activists. Violence became a part of daily life. The economy collapsed under hyperinflation, strikes crippled industries, and political assassinations filled the news. Amid this turmoil, Argentina's military saw itself as the nation's savior. They believed that only through complete control could they cleanse the country of what they called subversion. This belief in an internal enemy came from military doctrines influenced by the Cold War. Argentine officers were trained in counterinsurgency, tactics that emphasized eliminating ideological threats rather than defeating armies. To them, a school teacher with progressive ideas or a student demanding justice could be as dangerous as an armed guerrilla. On March 24, 1976, tanks rolled through Buenos Aires, communication centers were seized, and a military junta, led by General Jorge Rafael Videla, took power. The coup was swift and bloodless on the surface, but it opened the door to a reign of terror. Political parties were banned, unions dismantled, Congress dissolved, and the media silenced. The generals called their plan the National Reorganization Process. They claimed it would restore Argentina to its rightful, moral, and religious values. But in reality, it became a campaign to eliminate dissent through fear. Security forces began rounding up anyone suspected of having leftist sympathies. People disappeared in the middle of the night, dragged away in unmarked Ford Falcons that became symbols of dread. Families whispered in fear, afraid even to ask questions. The abducted were taken to clandestine detention centers scattered throughout the country. One of the most infamous was the Navy Mechanics School in Buenos Aires, known as ESMA. Once a place of military training, it became a chamber of horror. Prisoners were blindfolded, chained, and subjected to relentless torture, electric shocks, beatings, sexual assault, and psychological torment. Many were never seen again. Their names vanished from public records, their existence erased by a government that claimed they had simply gone missing. Most of those taken were not armed militants. They were young students, writers, teachers, social workers, priests, and even pregnant women. In many cases, being mentioned in someone's address book or attending a protest was enough to be labeled subversive. The goal wasn't just to extract information, it was to destroy communities and instill silence. Fear became a weapon, spreading faster than any bullet could. Families filed legal petitions demanding answers, but the government ignored them or threatened them into silence. The disappeared los desaparecidos became a chilling new word in Argentina's vocabulary, representing people who had effectively been erased from existence. The regime perfected methods to ensure these people would never be found. Some were buried in unmarked graves, others burned, and many were thrown into the sea during the so-called death flights. Prisoners were drugged, loaded onto military planes, and pushed out over the Atlantic Ocean. The sea became their graveyard. Occasionally boats washed ashore, but most vanished forever. It was a deliberate strategy to leave no trace, no body to mourn, no evidence to expose the regime's crimes. But even in this climate of terror, resistance refused to die. In 1977, a small group of women began gathering every Thursday in Buenos Aires, Plaza de Mayo. They were mothers searching for their disappeared children. Public protests were illegal, so they walked silently in circles. Wearing white headscarves embroidered with their children's names, they became known as the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. The regime mocked them, calling them crazy women, but their courage inspired others. Their weekly marches drew attention from international media and human rights organizations, breaking through the wall of silence. Over time, another group emerged, the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. They focused on finding babies who had been born in captivity to detained mothers and then given away to military families or government supporters under false identities. These women dedicated their lives to finding those lost children, using DNA testing decades later to reunite more than 100 of them with their true families. Yet many remain missing to this day. The Dirty War was not an isolated Argentine tragedy. It was part of a broader regional operation known as Operation Condor. In the mid-1970s, several right-wing military governments across South America, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil joined forces to create a secret network for intelligence sharing and cross-border repression. Their goal was to eliminate political opponents wherever they fled. A dissident who escaped from Argentina could be captured and killed in Chile, and a Chilean refugee could be hunted down in Buenos Aires. The borders between nations became meaningless for those targeted by the regime. Declassified documents later revealed that the United States was aware of this network and viewed it as part of the larger struggle against communism, though not always directly involved. Washington's silence and support for anti-communist regimes allowed Condor to operate unchecked. It was a chilling example of how Cold War ideology blurred moral lines, turning human lives into expendable pieces in a geopolitical game. Inside Argentina, the Junta also faced a growing economic crisis. While they waged war against subversion, inflation continued to spiral out of control. Poverty deepened, industries collapsed, and the government's promises of order and prosperity proved hollow. Corruption spread through the military ranks, and the elite benefited from new economic policies that crushed the working class. Yet, the generals continued to justify their rule as a fight for national salvation. As international pressure grew and human rights groups exposed the horrors of the regime, cracks began to appear. The failed Falklands War in 1982 was the final blow. The defeat humiliated the military and shattered its claim to legitimacy. Within a year, democracy returned to Argentina, and the dictatorship fell, but the scars it left behind were deep and lasting. Thousands of families still search for answers. The mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo continue their marches, a living reminder that truth cannot be buried forever. The Dirty War remains a lesson not only for Argentina but for the world of how fear, ideology, and power can turn a government against its own people, and how even in the darkest times, courage and memory can survive. The military regime placed José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz in charge of the economy, viewing him as the architect who could transform Argentina into a modern market-oriented nation. His policies were designed to dismantle decades of state intervention and usher in a new era of liberalization. The government began deregulating financial markets, opening the economy to foreign imports, privatizing public assets, and reducing the influence of labor unions. Wages were frozen. Collective bargaining was restricted, and strikes were brutally suppressed with the same determination used against political opponents. On paper, these policies promised to end inflation and attract international investment. In the short term, the government managed to slow the rapid rise of prices, creating an illusion of stability and prosperity. But beneath the surface, these reforms hollowed out Argentina's industrial base, weakened local businesses, and created massive unemployment. Wealth became concentrated in the hands of a few elites, while ordinary workers found themselves stripped of rights and job security. The social and economic system that had supported Peronism for decades, state protection for workers, domestic manufacturing, and social welfare was systematically dismantled. The promise of modernization came at the cost of national independence and social equality. Factories closed, and Argentina's once thriving industrial neighborhoods fell silent. Foreign debt ballooned as the government borrowed heavily to maintain its policies, leaving the country increasingly dependent on international creditors. Liberalization was never a replacement for repression. It functioned alongside it. The silence enforced by fear allowed the government to reshape society without opposition. The combination of economic and political control created a new kind of order, one that rewarded loyalty and punished dissent, ensuring that wealth and power flowed upward while the working class suffered in silence. In Washington, U.S. officials initially viewed the new Argentine regime with cautious approval. To them, it was a government that promised to restore stability and fight communism in a region they feared could fall under leftist influence. The United States had long preferred authoritarian allies who could keep their nations firmly in the anti-communist camp. This logic prevailed in the first years of Argentina's dictatorship. Diplomats and military officers saw Argentina as another front in the ideological struggle between East and West. But by the late 1970s, the tide began to shift. President Jimmy Carter placed human rights at the center of U.S. foreign policy. His administration reduced military aid, pressured Buenos Aires for answers about the thousands who had disappeared, and supported investigations by international human rights organizations. The dictatorship, once praised for restoring order, now found itself under scrutiny. Still, even as criticism grew, the underlying Cold War logic remained. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981, he reversed course, prioritizing anti-communist alliances over human rights concerns. The Argentine military regained Washington's favor, becoming a valuable ally in training and advising right-wing forces across Central America, particularly in Nicaragua and El Salvador. It was a bitter irony. A government condemned for human rights abuses at home was now viewed as a partner in promoting freedom abroad. The contradiction revealed the moral blindness of Cold War politics, where ideology often outweighed justice, and the same crimes that horrified the world were ignored when they served a geopolitical purpose. By the early 1980s, however, the junta's power began to crumble. The economic miracle promised by Martínez de Hoz had collapsed. Inflation returned, foreign debt exploded, and poverty deepened. Public faith in the regime vanished. Within the military, rivalries grew fierce. Hardliners clashed with so-called moderates, and divisions between the Army, Navy, and Air Force eroded any remaining unity. In December 1981, General Leopoldo Galtieri rose to power. Desperate to restore the military's image and hold on to authority, he turned to nationalism as a weapon to rally the country. On April 2, 1982, Galtieri ordered the invasion of the Falkland Islands, known in Argentina as the Islas Malvinas, small archipelago long disputed with the United Kingdom. The operation, codenamed Rosario, was intended to distract the nation from its economic collapse and reignite patriotic pride. For a brief moment, it worked. Crowds filled the Plaza de Mayo, cheering soldiers as heroes. Even critics of the regime joined in nationalistic fervor, seeing the invasion as a just effort to reclaim territory taken by colonial powers. But the euphoria was short. In London, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher reacted decisively. The British launched a powerful naval task force and, after a bitter campaign, retook the islands. The war lasted only 10 weeks, but the humiliation for Argentina was immense. The death toll was heavy, and the defeat shattered what little legitimacy the military government had left. Galtieri was forced to resign in June 1982, and General Reynaldo Bignoni assumed the presidency with one mission: to oversee the military's retreat from power. In the following months, political life began to reawaken. Newspapers reopened, unions resurfaced, and opposition parties re-emerged. The silence of fear was broken, and a flood of hidden truths began to surface. For the first time in years, Argentines could speak openly about the disappearances, torture centers, and corruption that had defined the dictatorship. On October 30, 1983, the people of Argentina went to the polls in a free election and chose Raúl Alfonsín as president. On December 10, democracy was officially restored. The generals had hoped to negotiate immunity for their crimes, believing the new government would protect them in exchange for a peaceful transition. But Alfonsín faced an impossible dilemma. He had to balance the demands of justice with the risk of military rebellion. Determined to pursue truth without collapsing the fragile democracy, he established the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, which produced the landmark report known as Nunca Más Never Again. The report gathered testimonies from survivors, witnesses, and families of the disappeared, creating a record of the atrocities that could no longer be denied. In 1985, Argentina did something almost unprecedented in world history. It placed its former military rulers on trial in civilian courts. Over months of harrowing testimony, survivors recounted stories of torture, murder, and loss. Families described years of searching for loved ones who never returned. Even some perpetrators came forward, exposing the machinery of terror that had operated under the name of national security. When the verdicts came, the nation watched in silence. General Jorge Rafael Videla and Admiral Emilio Massera were sentenced to life in prison. Others received lengthy sentences. For the first time, a Latin American dictatorship was being held accountable by its own people. Justice, however, would not come easily. The military still wielded significant influence, and a series of uprisings in the late 1980s threatened to destabilize the new democracy. Under pressure, Congress passed two controversial laws, the Full Stop and Do Obedience Acts. These laws set deadlines for new prosecutions and excused lower-ranking officers, who claimed they had simply followed orders. Then, in the 1990s, presidential pardons extended forgiveness even further, freeing many of those previously convicted. For the families of the victims, it was a crushing betrayal. The promise of justice seemed to fade once again. Yet memory proved stronger than silence. Human rights groups, led by the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, continued their relentless search for truth. New generations of Argentines joined the movement, demanding that justice be restored. In the early 2000s, their efforts bore fruit when Argentina's Supreme Court declared the amnesty laws unconstitutional. Trials resumed, and one by one, those responsible for the disappearances, torture, and killings were brought back to court. Hundreds of former military officers, policemen, and even civilians involved in the repression have since been convicted. The process has been slow and often painful, but it represents something rare in history: a nation confronting its own past. Today, Argentina continues to bear the weight of its history, but it also stands as a symbol of perseverance and courage. The story of the dirty war reminds the world that no matter how long it takes, truth has a way of emerging. The regime that once believed it could erase people from existence was itself erased by the collective memory of the very citizens it tried to silence. The message that echoes across Argentina's history is clear. Even in the darkest times, justice can be delayed, but it can never be denied forever. The story of Argentina cannot be understood in isolation. It must be viewed within the broader and complex web of the Cold War that engulfed Latin America for decades. Across the region, from the coup in Brazil in 1964 to Pinochet's brutal takeover of Chile in 1973 and the military regimes that swept through Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina, one pattern emerged. These governments believed that the armed forces were not just soldiers meant to protect the nation's borders, but guardians of its morality, identity, and ideological purity. They saw themselves as saviors of the nation's soul. To them, dissent was not simply political opposition, it was treason. The Cold War in Latin America was not only a clash between two superpowers, it was a war of ideas, fought in classrooms, in the press, in police stations, and in the minds of citizens. The United States and the Soviet Union competed for influence, but for Latin American militaries, this global tension became an excuse to justify repression at home. The region's officers were trained through U.S.-backed programs like the School of the Americas, where they learned that social reform movements, labor unions, or even student protests were early signs of communist subversion. Intelligence networks blurred the distinction between domestic and foreign threats, sharing data on anyone suspected of holding leftist sympathies. Governments, embassies, and international organizations often looked the other way, cloaking their silence in the language of diplomacy and anti-communism. In this way, the Cold War's ideological shadow legitimized the violence of military regimes and silenced their critics under the guise of defending freedom. Yet, Argentina's story, while soaked in tragedy, is also one of extraordinary courage and endurance. It is a story of mothers who turned grief into resistance, gathering week after week in the Plaza de Mayo, holding photographs of their vanished children, demanding answers from a regime that denied their existence. It is the story of lawyers who risked arrest and torture to defend prisoners of conscience, journalists who secretly smuggled reports of atrocities to the outside world, and survivors who stood in courtrooms years later to recount horrors no one wanted to hear. These acts of defiance built a slow, fragile bridge from silence to truth, from fear to justice. They transformed Argentina from a place of whispered terror into a society that began to confront its own dark past. Even today, the ghosts of the dictatorship linger. Argentina continues to wrestle with the legacy of that era with questions of amnesty, military accountability, and how to teach this painful history to future generations. There are still those who deny the scale of the disappearances, who argue that the regime's actions were necessary to save the country from chaos. But the powerful culture of remembrance that has taken root, the museums, memorials, public trials, and, most importantly, the mothers and grandmothers who continue their weekly marches ensures that denial is met with truth. Never again is not just a slogan written in history books. It is a living promise renewed every time a victim's name is spoken in public. The dirty war forces us to ask deeper questions, not only about Argentina but about the Cold War itself. What happens when the rhetoric of freedom and civilization becomes an excuse to destroy those very ideals? How far can a state go in the name of protecting itself before it loses its moral legitimacy? What responsibility do powerful nations bear when their alliances and policies enable repression? The United States, Western Europe, and the Soviet Union all faced these questions, and their responses were often contradictory. In the name of stability and containment, foreign powers offered aid, intelligence, and legitimacy to governments that tortured and murdered their own citizens. Argentina's experience reveals how those decisions, made in conference rooms thousands of miles away, resulted in real human suffering, in disappeared sons, daughters, and generations haunted by loss. The Argentine Junta described its campaign as a dirty war, implying that such brutality was necessary in a world without moral clarity. But the truth is that dirty wars are not fought for survival. They are fought when leaders decide that the people themselves have become the enemy. Wrapped in the language of national security and order, The dictatorship unleashed terror in the name of protection. The result was a nation fractured, silenced, and scarred for generations. Yet from that suffering emerged a remarkable truth. Even after years of lies and fear, a society can choose honesty. It can choose law over revenge, memory over denial, and justice over silence. The persistence of Argentina's mothers remains one of history's most moving symbols. Every Thursday, they continue to walk in the Plaza de Mayo, their white kerchiefs representing the diapers of their lost children. Many are frail now, their steps slower, but beside them walk younger generations, their children and grandchildren, carrying photographs, banners, and an unbroken chain of memory. They remind the world that the line between security and repression is always fragile, and that democracy depends on the courage of those willing to stand in public and demand answers. These women transformed personal pain into collective power. They turned the act of remembering into an act of resistance. Argentina's long path toward truth has been neither easy nor complete. The restoration of democracy, the creation of truth commissions, the public trials, and the recovery of stolen identities have slowly rewritten the national conscience. Former torture centers have been turned into museums. Schoolchildren now visit these places to learn what happened, why it happened, and how to prevent it from happening again. Each testimony recorded, each name engraved on a memorial, and each reunion between stolen children and their real families represents a victory over the silence the dictatorship tried to impose. The Cold War's legacy in Argentina is not just one of violence. It is also a story of how a society, broken by terror, can rebuild itself through truth and courage. But even with these achievements, Argentina's story reminds the world that the questions raised by the Cold War are not gone. What is the purpose of the state? Who deserves protection under its laws? How far can fear drive a government away from its own principles? The Junta answered these questions through repression and secrecy. Democracy, in contrast, answered through transparency and accountability. Between these two visions stand the disappeared, those whose absence became the nation's conscience. Their silence speaks louder than any speech, teaching Argentina that security built on fear is never security at all. The ultimate irony of the dirty war is that the regime, which sought to erase its enemies from history, ended up immortalizing them. Their names now fill textbooks, plaques, and memorial walls. Their stories are told in classrooms and documentaries, not as tales of defeat but of resilience. Never again. Nunca MS is not just a declaration. It is a vow, a collective memory that binds Argentina's past to its future. It is the promise of a nation that has learned through unimaginable pain that true security cannot come from the destruction of its own people. As the mothers still circle the Plaza de Mayo, their white scarves glinting in the sunlight, their slow march carries the memory of those who vanished and the hope that no generation will ever suffer as theirs did. Argentina's journey from fear to truth stands as a powerful reminder to the world that justice, though delayed, can still prevail, and that memory, when defended with courage, becomes the strongest form of resistance.